Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Larry Pulley. I'm privileged to be Dean of the William and Mary Mason School of Business. We are having a magnificent 2013 McGlothlin Leadership Forum, and I welcome all of you to the signature event, our panel discussion this afternoon. I welcome also a large number of folks who are joining us online, facilitated in part by our 2013 media sponsor, Virginia Business Magazine, and I would like to introduce their president and thank him, Mr. Bernie Niemeyer.
As Dean Pulley said, I'm Bernie Niemeyer, publisher of Virginia Business Magazine. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, so we're a 27-year-old monthly magazine published here in the state of Virginia. Obviously, our staff with 27 years of experience has been around the business world a bit. We've had the experience of being part of a large corporation when we were started out, and since 2009, we've had the experience of being a small, independent entrepreneurial organization as well. So we've seen the best of both business worlds. This event is important to us, first and foremost, because William and Mary and the Mason School are great customer friends of the magazine, but equally important because being a part of the business community, we realize the importance of education on all levels to the future of business here in the state of Virginia, and this has become even more apparent as government spending, for a lot of complex reasons our panelists, I'm sure we know, has been cut back a bit, and we think it's important for the business community to step up and do what they can to be more involved in the educational process. Earlier, you heard me use the phrase a customer friend, and that's something I take pretty seriously. Actually, I do have an MBA. It's not a phrase I learned in MBA school. It's a phrase I learned from a salesperson I worked with a long time ago, and I think that when you think about yourselves as developing subject matter experts, you really need to remember that it's not just the products and the services that we have, it's the relationships. Because nobody really gets paid until a sale gets made. So when you go out about your futures in the business world, if you can think of your customers, not just as customers, your expertise is not just on product and service, but your expertise in relationships, and treat people like friends. That'll go a long way. So thanks again for having me here, and we look forward to seeing the rest of the event, and I'll turn the mic back over to Dean Pulley.
And thank you for your partnership. It's now my privilege to recognize the visionaries and sponsors behind the McGlothlin Leadership Forum, Jim and Fran McGlothlin. I hope everyone will join me in thanking them for making this possible and having the vision and the idea behind this. I can tell you we are in for a huge treat this afternoon, and I now turn the podium over to our moderator, Mr. Jim McGlothlin.
Thank you, Larry, and welcome to the panel. We first have Senator Evan Bayh, former governor of Indiana and a U.S. Senator from Indiana, and now a practicing attorney with McGuire Woods, whose headquarters in Richmond, Virginia, I believe. Linda Klein, an attorney with Baker Donaldson in Atlanta, president of the Georgia Bar and managing partner of her firm. Welcome, Linda. And we have Glenn Hutchins, the senior partner, I'm sure, of Silver Lake Partners, a group that just bought, along with Michael Dell Computer Products. We've just heard from Glenn, just an amazing talk this afternoon and at lunch, and I'm sure we're going to go forward with a lot more of the current information from our panel. And without further ado, I'll begin to ask some questions, and we'll hear from our panel. Our first question is for Senator Bayh. When will the U.S. government take a more long-term approach to solving the debt crisis instead of revisiting the issue every 6 months?
Probably not as soon as any of us would like, Jim. If these problems were easy to solve, it would have been done a long time ago. But By the way, for those of you who had a chance to join us for lunch and see Glenn's amazing presentation, you saw that one of his precepts for business management, making decisions, is in God we trust, all others bring data. Well, since I served in the government, was involved in politics for 20 years, I brought no data because it's a data-free zone. What's taking place in Washington right now. At its heart, the reason this is going to take a while is if you took a public opinion poll today, the American people are fairly divided on basic philosophical issues about how the country should be run. If you ask a question as basic as, do you think the government should be more active and involved in solving society's problems or less active, it's already too intrusive, the results will be split 50-50. And so there's that division which ordinarily the public could work its way through, as we do in our communities and businesses and civic organizations. But there are some things in the political process today that are exacerbating and deepening this divide within the public. In the House of Representatives, the gerrymander means that out of 435 representatives, all but about 50 of them, their real election is in their primary. And so if you're a Democrat, you're concerned about a challenge from the left, you move to the left. If you're a Republican, you're worried about a challenge in the primary, you move to the right. That means there aren't many people left in the center anymore, where usually principled compromises have to be reached. In the Senate, we don't have to worry about the gerrymander, of course, but there are some things at work there as well, and we don't have time to go through all of them. But the role of large money in politics today has played a role in the Senate. Take my home state of Indiana as an example. Six-term United States Senator Richard Lugar, happens to be a Republican, was defeated in the Republican primary last year in my state. He was challenged by a Tea Party member for being insufficiently conservative. And the reason I mention all this, there are two data points to take away. I did bring a little data, Glenn. One is, what happened in that primary? 36 years, he hadn't voted for Obamacare, he hadn't voted for the stimulus, he hadn't voted for Dodd-Frank, he hadn't voted for any of the signature initiatives of the Obama administration or the Democrats in Congress. It was, smaller stuff, but still that was insufficiently orthodox for some, so he was challenged. The two data points are fewer than 1 in 20 Republicans voted in the primary. 18% showed up to vote, even though it was widely known that we were having an election. So you had a very narrow sliver of the party. And by the way, if it had been a Democratic primary, it would have been the same thing. So you have a very narrow sliver of the electorate participating in primaries. And so that's number one. If maybe 40% of the Republicans had voted, Richard Lugar probably would have prevailed in that challenge. And a similar thing happened to Bob Bennett in Utah 2 years before that. Lisa Murkowski in Alaska lost her primary, had to run as a write-in candidate. You had elections in Delaware, Missouri, and elsewhere. Same sort of phenomenon going on. So a lot of the members in the Senate look at that and think, we break with the party line at our peril. Reaching out to the other side really puts us on almost anything, not just big things, anything puts us at risk. Historically, though, that wouldn't be enough. The second thing I want to mention, in addition to low voter turnout, is the role of big money. Senator Lugar's opponent, a man named Richard Murdoch, as recently as 4 years ago, he couldn't have raised $100,000. But because of some interpretations by the Supreme Court of our constitutional right of free speech, and I can't tell you, I'm not enough of a constitutional scholar to tell you whether that's good jurisprudence or not, but I can tell you the political impact. $6 million of negative ads flooded into the state of Indiana, all denouncing Richard Lugar, from independent expenditure groups, which would never have existed before. And so a combination of a very low voter turnout, where only the most ideological and the most partisan choose our nominees in primaries, combined with large sums of money that will punish anybody who compromises at all or deviates even in the least bit from the party line, have caused these philosophical divisions within the public to be exacerbated substantially in the political class in Washington. And so we've arrived at a point, and the question was, when will this, we take a longer term view, and I jokingly said not soon enough. I think we will eventually get there, but it's going to be very difficult, because to really solve the problems, and Glenn on one of his slides had up entitlement spending and that sort of thing, the Democrats would have to be willing to address entitlement spending, particularly in the healthcare arena. Social Security is politically difficult, but not intellectually difficult to deal with. And you may have seen last week, Jim, when there was even a suggestion that the current impasse might lead to a broader discussion about how to get our long-term fiscal house in order. 30 members of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives immediately sent out a letter saying to the president, don't you touch one comma or one period on entitlements. We're not going to support that. That's not where you should go. Conversely, on the other side of the aisle, there's just no appetite whatsoever for looking at the revenue side of the equation. And so both sides know if they were to challenge that conventional wisdom, they would probably be taken on in a primary, and it would basically be an act of, potentially an act of ending their political careers, so forth and so on. So my short answer, Jim, is there's some chance in the current crisis that we make some progress, and we've nibbled away at it over the course of the last a few years with a series of mini deals. But I honestly think to finally get to where we need to go, which is putting us on a long-term sustainable path to getting our fiscal house where it ought to be, it may take an exogenous event of some kind. And I would analogize to the TARP situation a few years ago, and I know I'm being a senator and filibustering here, but you may recall, this gets in summary to what I'm trying to say. This was a terrible situation. We were looking into the abyss of a complete global financial meltdown. We all knew something had to be done. Various proposals have been floated. None of them were popular. And so finally the decision was made to inject capital into the banking system to shore it up, to allow the economy to stabilize and to begin the recovery. My calls and letters were running 15,000 to 1 against the TARP bill. This was political death. And yet it passed the Senate 75 to 25. Democrats, Republicans, all deciding, okay, we know this is unpopular, but we got to do the right thing. In the Senate, that's more likely to happen because many of the members don't run again for 4 or 6 years. It goes over to the House, where they're all running every 2 years. The House votes it down. The Dow Jones Industrial Average drops 720 or 30 points in an hour and a half. And then the House came back a day or two later and passed the bill because there was a demonstrable evidence at that point, which they could go home and show the electorate, look, I didn't want to do this, it was unpopular, but I had to. I'm afraid, given the current forces politically I described and the gridlock that we have, it may take an exogenous event similar to the precipice of the financial crisis to finally resolve this. I hope not, it shouldn't, but that may be what it takes.
Well, in view of your comments, what are the prospects of settling next week our deficit ceiling?
Well, I think it's still a probability that we won't go beyond the period of, and get into a however you wanted to describe it, a default, what have you, go beyond the debt. I still think that's more likely than not, but with each passing day, I think the possibility of having something like a market reaction force them to do the right thing becomes more likely. It's sort of a circular situation where the markets and the public have become accustomed to this sort of brinksmanship, so they all assume that the rational thing will ultimately be done. Therefore, there's not the kind of exogenous market event that would force them to do the right. It doesn't happen, thereby making the likelihood of a tail risk event like a default more likely. It's deeply ironic, but there you have it. So I think, look, at the end of the day, I still think the president will be inclined to try and provide some face-saving way out of this for the Speaker of the House. I think the Speaker of the House does not want to default the country. He tried initially to float some proposals that would have avoided all of this. That was unacceptable to a fraction of his caucus. And so we are where we are. But I think the president is, right now, if you believe the polls, the current dynamic is favoring the Democrats. But as we approach the day of reckoning, I do believe the president will say, even though I'm winning politically, why roll the dice and run the risk with the welfare of the country of going into this unknown? And maybe I'd look for some alternatives to allow the Speaker a way out. The Tea Party won't support what that way out is, but I do think a majority of the Republicans in the House, or at least enough of the Republicans in the House at that point, will say, we don't want to default either. Let's all back out of the corner we've gotten ourselves into.
Glenn, at breakfast this morning, you had some thoughts about this crisis and how it might be solved with a little face saving for both parties. Would you like to share that?
I think Evan and I talked about this at breakfast. We all were talking about it at breakfast, yeah. So two things. One is that there are two things that are happening simultaneously here that in prior of these crises have been separate. One is called the continuing resolution, otherwise known as in the lingo as the CR, and the second is the debt limit. And the continuing resolution is there because the Congress has not been able to pass a budget bill in 2 years, Evan? When was the last time we had it?
It's been 3 or 4. It's been a long time.
So they literally have not been able to pass a budget bill, and this is highly unusual in American history. And so you have a continuing resolution, which is you keep spending the same amount for the next time period, whether it's 6 months or 12 months. And so that's when, and as a result of getting to the time period in which government spending the authorization of government spending had stopped, that's why the government shut down. It so happens that that's happening almost simultaneously with the debt limit running out right now. And then the Treasury Secretary said that's about October 17. And we can operate, as we've shown over the course of American history, for brief periods of time without the government operating. Whenever I'll add one parenthetical, whenever the government's been shut down, the people who sort of were most vocal about in government become the most vocal about kind of wanting it back when they realize the implications of it. But that's something that's been put to the side. But we cannot, and I repeat, we cannot mess with the creditworthiness of the United States of America. That is a financial weapon of mass destruction. From the time of George Washington, we have worked on, through the offices of Alexander Hamilton, subsequent Treasury Secretaries, the sterling quality of the American creditworthiness. This would be a disaster of historic proportions to allow the U.S. government to default. It would be damaging in the very long term to our nation's economic growth and credibility. And it risks unintended consequences that could, I can't make predictions, but when Lehman failed, nobody knew that the money funds would break the buck. I mean, the unintended consequences of dominoes falling over when you allow something like that to happen, and what happens ultimately from that is unpredictable. I'll tell you, the U.S. defaulting on the debt is a more catastrophic event, in my personal view, than Lehman failing. So I just think that's not playing with dynamite, that's playing with nuclear weapons, and can't happen. So we have to get out of it. There are 2 ways to get out of it, potentially. I think Evan's right. The president's eventually going to have to be the adult because the Tea Party won't compromise. And the president, even though he's probably winning politically, he's going to have to say what's good for the country is what's good for the country. And so the 2 of them are going to have to come together and get something done. There are 2 things that have been talked about. By 2 of them, I mean Boehner, the Speaker of the House, the President of the United States. 2 has been some minor compromise, face saving for the Tea Party on the a piece of the Affordable Care Act, which is the device tax. Is that what it's called, Evan?
Medical device tax.
Medical device tax. That might be one thing where you repeal that. And another might be something which is going on in the Senate, I believe, right now, which is to separate the continuing resolution from the debt limit and have the debt limit be extended so that we don't default, but not fund the government so that we continue in a shutdown. And then they can still debate how much money should we be spending on what in the government, with the forcing item being the government be open or shut, but not putting the United States government credit risk in jeopardy. I think there are other kinds of solutions that will work out, but we have to have something that allows the 2 parties to reach a compromise in a context where I don't think the Tea Party will agree to an effective compromise so that we can avoid this debt, avoid defaulting on the debt.
Linda, do you have any thoughts about that from a different perspective from your profession?
We were talking at breakfast about these kinds of issues, and I'm not sure that I have anything to add to what is a very thorough discussion of these issues.
Can I just add one thing, Jim? And that is, I think Glenn is exactly right. This is not the time to be running great risks with the economy. The growth rate is already very tepid.
This is an important point.
Yeah, if the economy was growing at 3.5%, 4%, maybe you could run some risk at the margins. But we're teetering in there. And Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the private economy was doing somewhat better, but because of the contractionary policies, fiscally, I think that's taken, what, 1.4% off of growth, something like that?
There are different estimates, but that's not wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is not the time for the government to be restraining growth in the private part of the economy. It's a greater risk today of tipping back over into a recession or something really bad.
Can I elaborate on that for a second? There's something the economists call animal spirits, which is really, really important to economic activity. If you feel optimistic, you go start businesses, shop, do whatever is necessary to generate economic activity. And the loss of confidence that comes from just dysfunction in Washington is enough to have a meaningful damper effect on economic activity. And it's precisely when we're getting some momentum to sort of pull the rug out from it by a crisis that we manufactured ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, and are doing to ourselves is unfortunate.
We looked at the enemy and it was us.
Exactly.
I was out of the country for a week last week, and when you talk about closing the government, they were aghast that we would close our own government. Why would you do this? So, I mean, it's pretty simple stuff. Well, moving along, Glenn, I have a question that was submitted to you, and the question is, what is your assessment of the feasibility and long-term effects on our nation's ability to not only provide high-quality and sustainable health care for our citizens, but maintain our superior quality of research and development for new medical technologies in light of the Affordable Care Act?
Well, look, I think that I'm a supporter of the Affordable Care Act. By the way, it turns out if you do polls across the country, 10% more people support the Affordable Care Act than they do Obamacare. Even though it's the same thing. So I think I worked a little bit on healthcare years ago in the White House, and so I've got just a tiny little bit of experience with it. And I think the Affordable Care Act did 2 or 3 really important things. The first is that it did insurance reform, getting rid of pre-existing conditions, exclusions to care, and covering people when kids, your own kids up to 26 years old, and various things like that. And the other thing it did was to get everybody in the insurance pool, because until you have everybody covered by insurance, you're not going to be able to get costs under control. Because just because I'm on the board of the large hospital system in New York City, and just because they're not insured doesn't mean we're not treating them. And we provide some of the most expensive health care in the world to the people who show up in our emergency rooms and wouldn't come to our emergency rooms if they had their own physicians and could either get preventive medicine, prevent the emergency event, or be able to go to their own doctor as opposed to come to the emergency room for basic care. And so they're in the system. So it's not until you get everybody in the system that you can begin to work on costs, because you have enough control over it. That's kind of, I think those 2 things are important. We still need to do 3 more things to bring the healthcare system under control, I believe. One is we need to increasingly get people off of employer-provided plans and into being intelligent consumers of their own health care. The vast majority of people spend much more time looking at the cost of a car than the cost of a cardiac surgery. And that's just nuts, because it both costs more and is more important to them. But they're not intelligent consumers because their business does it for them. The second is that we need to get more people into situations where we manage their care as opposed to provide fee-for-service. So the incentives are bad for the consumers because they're not intelligent consumers of their product. The incentives are bad for the doctors because the more they do, the more money they make, rather than a fee-for-service medicine as opposed to a capitated or bundled payments plan. And then we have to get at medical malpractice costs, which I think are just much too much of a cost to the system. So I think the Affordable Care Act did some important things, but I think it's sort of, it's half done, and we need to continue. By the way, one of the surprising things that's happened in the last couple of years is that the inflation of medical care costs has come down substantially from what anybody projected. And so some of the reforms that we've had in the system and some of the work that employers, I think, are doing to bring costs down is starting to really kind of bite. And so we know, I think that's good evidence that we can get this thing under control, get this monster under control, because, go back to the issue we're talking about, by far the biggest issue in all this budget fight is going to be the cost of health care. The cost of our Medicare and Medicaid system, primarily Medicare, is 6 to 8 times the cost of Social Security in terms of a budget item, and the only way we're going to be able to get our budget under control is to have this kind of reform. So I think Obamacare, I'll call it Obamacare, now people like it less, is a very important first step in that direction, in my view.
Is the hospital that you're on the board of a so-called safety net hospital?
Yeah.
And I understand that the Affordable Care Act changes the dynamics of how these safety net hospitals are funded, and that they're going to lose a lot of the funding that they've been relying on. And I don't know very much about it, but if you can tell us something about it. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm sophisticated about it. I know about as much as what you've said. But I think one of the real problems, whenever you have a major piece of complicated legislation like the Affordable Care Act, you need to be able to amend it. There are all sorts of lots of legislation that comes in years after, technical amendments to get things right, because big complicated thing, you got it right. And so one of the real problems with this arteriosclerosis in Congress, with Obamacare being held up as the poster child for all this, is we're not going to be able to get it right. You know, we're not going to be able to amend it in any important way because the two sides don't even agree on its existence. It's an existential problem rather than a set of mechanical problems they're trying to solve. So whatever those problems are there, we're just going to be stuck with them.
And so those
Linda,
hospitals may be in trouble.
Is that a fair way to put it?
Well, that's a very fair way to put it. These pieces of legislation aren't holy writ. They're a best first step that has to be approved, improved, amended, altered, and so forth going forward. I may be able to help somewhat with your problem, Linda. The large indigent care providing hospitals subsidize a lot of care because they're treating folks who, as Glenn pointed, show up, they have no insurance, no ability to pay. The hospital doesn't throw them out in the street. They treat them and they pass the costs on to the rest of us. It's cost shifting, so our insurance rates are higher because of all that. To try and help these hospitals, what are called disproportionate share payments have been made over the years. So
This is the dish payment issue?
The dish payment.
Okay.
So these payments have been made to hospitals that provide disproportionate amounts of care to the indigent to try and make up for that. So the theory was that those disproportionate payments would be done away with, but the states would expand their Medicaid eligibility, so all those folks would now be expanded by Medicaid. In the states where they have expanded Medicaid, that's exactly how it's going to work. The hospitals that are, as a matter of fact, those hospitals actually do somewhat better. They'll have a whole new flood of patients who can pay coming in. The states where there may be issues are the ones, now that there are no disproportionate share payments, but those states also decided not to expand Medicaid.
Like
so
mine.
the hospital will have its payments, its subsidy from the federal government cut, but it will now not have a new increase in insured patients showing up. And many of the hospitals in those states, mine being one of them, are deeply worried about their financial viability going forward.
And that's the conversation we're having in my state as well.
One problem that I hear about out in the hinterlands of America, and I never hear it discussed on the media, is that so many people are taking employees that have a full-time 40-hour-a-week job and moving them down to 29 hours or 30 hours a week so they don't have to provide medical care for them. And this is a group of people who need that 40-hour work week more than anyone else. And do you think that's occurring in large numbers across the country?
I've heard lots of anecdotal evidence that confirms what you just said, that it's both 30 hours and 50 people. Those are the two rules. You know, anytime you put a set of rules like that, so what it is you have to provide for your employer, you have to provide medical care or pay a penalty so that your employees can get medical care. If you have employed more than 50 people and or if your workers work more than 30 hours per week. And so I think it's predictable that employers who can make those choices will do that. They will do what you described, which is keep people below 30 hours a week to the extent they can, keep their employment bases below 50 people per employer, et cetera. I mean, I think that was reasonably predictable coming out of legislation. I've heard lots of anecdotal evidence that that's the case.
And I've seen lots of law firm newsletters where lawyers are recommending that to their clients.
Oh, is that right? Interesting.
Well, we're finding in my own company that we have a group of employees that don't take the health care. But they do, of course, if they find that they have a condition that requires health care, they immediately come and sign up. And so we're stuck with paying that bill for this one employee or the spouse or the family member, which it's a gigantic bill usually, but that's not offset by others who are paying into the pool because they don't buy until they find out they have the pre-existing or now pre-existing condition. So I think that's something that has been thought out too.
Well,
carefully.
I think Evan can probably explain to you how it's been thought out, but there is a penalty for not being insured.
It's $95 though.
Yeah, so the question is that is that penalty enough or not to offset this cost? Because it's very clear that some young people in particular, I think, will do something different than we just described, which is not insure themselves until they get a diagnosis that requires insurance and then go get insurance or not paying in. So the question is the penalty of the right size relative to the cost of the system of that sort of behavior or not? And that's, again, that's one of the things which experience would tell you, did you get it right or not? And you'd have a piece of legislation that might adjust that. Not sure if we'll be able to do that. Is that
Jim, to get back, I think that's right. To get back to your first question, Jim, if you ask the American people on a poll they have many of these same questions about the Affordable Care Act, what ought to be done, improvements that ought to be made, changes that ought to be instituted. They don't favor shutting the government. They favor shutting down the government to get there.
Right.
So that's why this politically is playing out in the way that it is.
Right. Well, hopefully that will get amended in the future in a beneficial way to everyone. But you just hear these horror stories at the moment that thousands of people are reduced to part-time work that certainly need full-time work, and hopefully it will get amended. Well, moving along to another question and changing subjects. Linda, do you think the system of how attorneys are paid in the United States is the right one? Should we have a loser pays system in all cases? Should the government supply lawyers to the poor in civil cases as well as they're doing now in criminal cases? So it's a 2 or 3 part question.
Oh, lots to talk about there. And we only have 90 minutes.
Are you going to charge us by the hour for it?
Right now, in 16 increments, right? Right now, the legal profession is undergoing lots of disruption, I think would be fair to say, about how legal services that people pay for as opposed to some legal where we're trying to get access to justice to the poor, which I'd like to talk about some more later. But there's a lot of disruption in the market, and we're seeing all kinds of changes that I think are permanent changes in the way that people will buy legal services. People are talking about fixed fees, just like when your business sells a unit of whatever it might make, you sell it for a fixed price, may give discount for volume. Well, now people are starting to look at selling legal services in the way that they were sold when Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer in trying cases. So the hourly method is something that in the history of the American legal system, I guess, is relatively new. All kinds of alternative fee systems are being thought of besides the fixed fee. And we can talk for hours and hours about that, and I'll be glad to take more questions about that. Law firms are working very hard, spending lots of time and energy trying to figure out ways to get to work more efficiently and more effectively. The use of technology, particularly analytics, is really changing the way legal services are going to be conducted in the future. Any law students that are out there will probably enter a very different legal profession where we leverage technology to try to make sure that when lawyers are working for clients, they're using their brains and not worrying about shifting paper. And if we want to stop there and then talk about access to justice for the poor, we can do that and come back.
How about loser pays? I think that was the main thrust of this question, probably.
The loser pay system is something that is gaining an increasing appetite in this country. We're seeing more and more courts being authorized to shift legal fees to the loser. What we want to be sure that there's a referee, and let's call that referee the judge. And the judge should get to decide, should get to have a feel for exactly what happened and whether it is truly equitable to make sure that all the legal fees shift from one side to another, to evaluate the amount of legal fees that were charged, whether they should all be shifted or whether any of it should be shifted. We want to be sure that people who would not otherwise have access to the courtroom can get a lawyer to take their case and not fear that somebody might later deem it frivolous when an experienced jurist would not think so.
Evan, do you have some thoughts about this subject?
Well, I have traditionally, Jim, favored, and I'm glad Glenn mentioned medical malpractice reform. I think that's one thing the Democrats should be willing to compromise on in the context of trying to get health care costs down, make the Affordable Care Act better. My own state is one that has some caps on damages and that sort of thing, and the costs, particularly in terms of medical malpractice insurance for our physicians, are much lower. Over near Illinois, we've got a lot of doctors who locate their practices in Indiana, just our side of the border, because of that phenomenon. Asbestos, that had been a problem for a long time. It was imposing huge costs in a very inefficient way on the American economy. There was a way we could provide restitution for people who've been hurt by asbestos without going through the tort system and all that. I favored changing that. I'm concerned that if you just go with a strict loser pay, that might deny access a little too much. Perhaps Linda's suggestion that you have the judge, an experienced referee, try and make those calls up front would be a sensible middle ground.
So I would look. It's obvious.
Can I say one thing, Glenn?
Yeah,
By the way,
please.
my comments. You're looking at someone. Although I'm an attorney, my wife's an attorney. We've never sued anybody. I've probably been sued 30,000 times. When you're a governor, everybody sues you. Particularly the inmates. They used to love to sue me.
I've been sued a lot too.
Yeah.
And what I was going to do, well, let's start with that, which is that I think I mentioned medical malpractice reform. I still think there's a lot of, in my experience, frivolous business litigation, particularly around transactions. It's just a cost in the system where people realize that they can take a toll on a business transaction by suing to slow it down, and you'll settle and keep moving on. And I think that sort of thing is very bad for the system, uniquely American, and should go away. But that said, I think we, having traveled the world and done business around the world, we should understand that we are really, really lucky to live in a country where you can negotiate a contract, sign it, and have it enforced. And I think the lawyers who I've worked with, were some of the smartest and most constructive business partners of mine, helped me do that, and I really value it. I'm willing to pay them a lot to get the best people to do that.
I'll give you my card.
And we're really lucky to live in a country with a set of regulations and a court system where we can go get redress. And so there are lots of bad parts to this, but we got to realize that they're bad parts of something which is fundamentally important and in many cases unique to the United States and a few other places in the world. And we should be happy about that.
There's no better system in the world, and I think we want to come back to that. But I do want to suggest that there may be another side on medical malpractice reform. The studies in my state show that the average tort verdict is less than $10,000. So it's not easy to get an experienced and accomplished lawyer to just take any case that walks in the door, and certainly not any medical malpractice case where it requires lots of study. It requires an affidavit from a physician in order to even file a lawsuit, which is something that's not necessarily required in almost any other type of case. And over 85% of the defendants win those cases in medical malpractice. And I wonder if, as the Affordable Care Act moves forward and juries understand that everyone is insured and everyone has their medical problems paid for, that verdicts in even states where verdicts might be higher will come down because the juries will factor that into their thought. So there are lots of studies. Some show that the cost of medical malpractice may be less than 2% of the cost of health care. I know that there are other studies on the other side. I'm just not ready to say that medical malpractice reform is...
I think those studies are fundamentally wrong. I've looked at them, I've talked to people about them, and they can't quantify, I think, correctly the cost of defensive medicine, which is huge, and particularly in some professions like OBGYN. And I think that's a very big part of our medical system. That's a shadow cost that I was thinking about. And so I think that, but I also think politically it's the way you get some other things done. In other words, it's the Democrats are typically against medical malpractice reform. Republicans are typically for it. Democrats can get something they want in return for the medical malpractice reform. So I think it's out there as a political thing to help us move down the path of things that are perhaps more important.
Right.
Does that make sense?
I would make that trade-off, Glenn.
Yeah, exactly.
This is something that remains to be seen, but I do know that that jurors often factor into their minds what...
I think it's a good point. I didn't mean to dismiss that. That was a very interesting point. I agree.
And I think that may make a difference, and this is all something that time is going to talk about. We didn't talk about access to the courts, and that is something that's absolutely critical. And when you have a system right now where we see, I want to call it starving of the justice system, where in my home state, the Chief Justice had to ask for people to donate pens and paper to the courthouse, where there are places you have to bring your own paper, or the clerk of court will not process your pleadings. That's justice denied. And when people can't get access to the courts, what do? Well, we like our courts to be public, because the idea of having precedent that people know about and then can rely upon for making their own business decisions. Well, when businesses take their disputes private, we lose that, and that's a disadvantage, certainly. But if you just can't get access to the court because you have a personal problem, maybe you need to get divorced, and the court is closed, that people have fought revolutions. Our own country fought a revolution because we didn't have access to justice. And certainly access to justice, right there, the first line of our Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union and provide access to justice. And that's the Constitution's promise to the citizens of this country.
You know, in medical malpractice, there is a perception in America that there are a lot of malpractice lawsuits. And I have a one-day outing once a year with about 15 or 20 physicians, and that's all they talk about. So last year, I said, I've heard this until it's nauseous. How many of you have been sued for medical malpractice? Just hold up your hand, one person. And I said, well, what did this cost? And he said, well, they withdrew it after 6 weeks. So if our friends are any indication, this might be more perception than reality, but maybe it's not so.
It affects their medical malpractice premiums, and it affects the way they practice medicine, as Glenn was saying, because even if they haven't been sued, they're afraid of being sued.
Yes, who owns the insurance company that offshore that insures these doctors?
Doctors themselves?
You got it. So, you know, maybe there is some logic to being frightened about this. Well, moving along and into other subjects, Senator Bide, do you believe that the current polarized party system will cause a strong, moderate third party to be created as the American populace begins to lose faith and confidence in the extremes that the traditional two-party system has now undertaken?
I think that's unlikely. If you were ever to have an environment where it were to happen, it would be under present circumstances. But you look historically at the success of third-party movements. Since the rise of the Republican Party and the demise of the Whigs shortly before the Civil War, we've had third-party candidates, to be sure, but they were not lasting. They tended to be one-off events. Maybe, you know, Ross Perot ran 2 cycles in a row, that sort of thing. I think more likely, and by the way, there was a group called Americans Elect. Did you hear this a couple years ago? So there was this, and I can't remember the fellow's name, but there was $25–30 million spent on this to try and qualify a third party called Americans Elect on the ballot. And I think they got onto 25 or 26 state ballots. And basically the pitch was, we will qualify you for the ballot. We'll raise the money for the campaign. Whoever they chose for president, if it was a Democrat, the vice presidential nominee would have to be a Republican, and vice versa. And they literally couldn't get anybody to run for a variety of reasons. Either it was not the right time in someone's life financially, it was they didn't want to be viewed as a renegade by their own party. The process was, you know, too negative. They didn't want to go through it, what have you. So there was a push last time for this, and it was unsuccessful. I think more likely is that you'll see a constant churning as the public is unhappy, and so we'll see more anti-incumbent elections. We had a change election in 2006. Public was mad about the Iraq War, took it out on the Republicans. Democrats took control of the House. 2008, you saw a continuation of that. We had the financial crisis. People still were unhappy about Iraq. Democrats come sweeping in, passed the Affordable Care Act, other things. There's a reaction to that. 2010, Tea Party, Republicans come sweeping in, gain control of the House. Probably would have gained control of the Senate if they hadn't gone too far in some of these states, as I was mentioning, nominated people who weren't electable. And this last time was really the first out of 4 elections we'd had a kind of a status quo election. Republicans kept the House, Democrats kept the Senate, picked up a seat or 2, and of course the president was reelected. If you look at the approval ratings now, for Congress to be sure, I think it's more likely than a third party. You'll just see a constant churning of people voting against the ins, whoever they are, because they're just unhappy with the status quo. The one thing in my mind that could change that would be if we get through this anemic growth period Glenn was outlining for us. If you had a better economic situation, people would feel better about the country and are a lot more likely to vote for incumbents under those set of circumstances. So short answer, no, I don't think a third party is likely. And you look at history, it's just pretty doggone hard. One final thing, Linda, forgive me. If you look at issues sometimes drive the rise of third parties too. Perot, when he first ran the first time, ran on, you know, you got to get the deficit down, we're going broke and so forth. Bill Clinton's elected, and with advice from Robert Rubin and others, decided to abandon a stimulus program that he talked about during the campaign and instead made getting the deficit down a big part of what he was about. So more likely that an existing party will glom on to the issue that's proven to be popular that a third party is espousing.
So I remember that everyone in Alaska learned to spell Murkowski because they had to write in her name.
Right.
So tell us about how that could happen, that kind of phenomenon.
Well, that was the first time since Strom Thurmond was elected in South Carolina back in the 1940s or 50s, half a century. Right. So, and for those of you who don't follow these sorts of things, Lisa Murkowski was the sitting United States Senator in Alaska. Her father had been in the Senator, I think he was governor at the time. In any event, very well-known family in Alaska. She was challenged by a Tea Party challenger, lost the Republican primary, a lot like Indiana, where I was describing. In Indiana, you cannot run as a write-in candidate. It's called a sore loser provision. You can't, if you lose, you can't say, well, I'm running as a third-party person. But in Alaska, you can. And so she mounted a third party. You had to write in. She wasn't on the ballot. You actually had to go in and write in on the part of the ballot that provided for that. Her name, and if you misspelled her name, and Murkowski, I mean, a lot like Bai's an unusual name. Her name's unusual and even longer, more, harder to spell. One letter wrong, you were going to have the ballot disqualified. So they had to run boatloads of ads with jingles and all sorts, spell Murkowski, spell Murkowski. Long story short, though, she ended up winning as a write-in candidate and is back in the United States Senate. But that, Linda, is very difficult to pull off, and as I said, hadn't been done in half a century.
So you would think that you could, the third-party thing would be useful, but so when I say to my friends who work for banks, which I don't, and they complain about how unpopular they are, I said, don't worry, look at the opinion polls, politicians are even less popular than you. It was like, I think the approval rating for Congress is now 18%.
Oh, it's lower than that, I think.
13? Yeah. 9%, okay. So that reminded me, Secretary Paulson, when he was Secretary of Treasury, once pointed out that more people approved of torture than approved of TARP. That there were more people for waterboarding than they were for TARP. So you'd think that might create something, but I've talked to one of the people who really studies these things, and he says if you really look at behavior, and the reason why I say this is about 20 to 25% of people classify themselves as independent, and then you've got people who are in both parties. But if you actually look at the voting behavior of the people who classify themselves as independent, there's some large number of people who want to say they're independent but vote in identical ways as Republicans and Democrats vote. And the real independents are about 7%. And so there's really not enough of the space in the middle there in the independents to create anything meaningful, I think.
That's exactly the conclusion both campaigns reached in the last election, Glenn, and that's why all the voter contact efforts were about mobilizing the base and getting the already convinced out to vote, because squabbling over that very narrow percentage in the middle just wasn't going to get you very far. Back to Congress for just one moment, and I'm not making this up, there was a recent survey that found that Congress was less popular than colonoscopies. but in a bit of good news, it still is somewhat more popular than the Kardashians. So maybe retiring members will start reality TV shows and descend even further, who knows?
I never thought I heard the Kardashians and colonoscopies used in the same sentence.
There you go. We live in strange times.
Well, thank you very much. Moving to a question for you, Glenn. Given the state of the economy and the situations always involving the environment, what industries do you believe will experience the largest increase in transaction volume or growth in the next 3 to 5 years, and what industries would you not invest in?
Well, it's interesting. So I'm not sure I have transaction volume. Obviously, I went all in technology, so so let's take that off to the side, because I'm sort of that's pretty obvious. I think the most interesting thing happening in the United States is now what's happening in the energy economy. And I think that is fundamentally transforming the future of our country, economic future of our country, in potentially very positive, beneficial ways. Now, there are obviously some very important environmental questions, problems that need to be solved. I think they can be solved. They need to be addressed and solved. A responsible businessman in the energy economy like you will do that. By the way, I'd be interested in what you would get to ask the questions. I want to ask you a question, which is what do you think about what I'm about to say, because this is your area of expertise. But I think the horizontal drilling and the fracking and the discovery of all this unconventional liquids is going to have a transformational impact on the United States in in North America, really, because you think about Mexico's now changing their constitution to make it easier to extract energy there. We got what's going on in Canada. We can have an energy economy that has a couple of important dimensions. One is this year we're in, the United States is likely to be the largest energy producer in the world. Full stop. Most people think it's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the largest oil producer, but actually the largest energy producer overall, including natural gas, has been Russia. And we're going to eclipse Russia this year in terms of the amount of energy we produce. One, a lot of it is very inexpensive natural gas, which will transform the cost basis of energy-intensive manufacturing in the United States, which will be very, very valuable. And I think over time, given the BTU equivalent price difference between oil and natural gas, and what is that as we sit today? Natural gas BTU equivalent is 30% the price of oil, something along those lines. Is that
Something
about right?
like that, maybe 35.
Yeah, some of that. And now, oil is mostly about transportation. Natural gas is mostly about heating and residential heating and cooling. But you can, over a very long time period, create the distribution and end-use equipment that allows you to do more electricity generation, even transportation with natural gas. That investment will be very valuable for our country as we make that transition, and that will then take down the cost basis of things other than what electricity generation and manufacturing with natural gas is used predominantly for today. And it'll also fundamentally change the geopolitics in the world if we are kind of energy secure as a region, and change and make what goes on in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran much less threatening to the world in which we live. So I think that's going to be a really interesting and important part of the world we live in. What do you think about that?
Well, I happened to give a speech 3 weeks ago about this very subject, so maybe I will give my opinion on it. Yeah. But if I could have a perfect world, I would take coal out of the equation to make electricity because of the pollution that is occurring through carbon dioxide, and I would make electricity with pretty much with nuclear generation, because I think it is safe and it is by far the cheapest fuel we have once you build these plants, and it's sustainable over a long, long period of time. So then I would take the coal that we are no longer making electricity with in order to keep the people employed with in the coal regions, and turn that into a liquid fuel for vehicles, for automobiles, trucks, aircraft, etc., and then use the natural gas that we have. And this would take 30 years. We'd be supplementing all this with the crude that we're drilling now, and we could run out of crude in 30 or 40 years if we drill in today's world. But I would then supplement that for the 30 years we're building the nuclear and we're changing from coal to liquids with our current crude. And as you say, I would try to avoid importing as much as possible. And then take the natural gas and put it into our industries, which would have a very, very low cost of energy then. And it ought to allow us to compete in our manufacturing plants and around the country in the most favorable way. So we would also reduce pollution, carbon dioxide, by about 50%, because we're getting a little more from coal to liquid than you do from crude to liquid. But we would be using none in the electric generating plants, which we have been producing about 54% of our electricity with coal.
So Evan, post the accident of Fukushima in Japan, do you think it's politically feasible to expand nuclear energy production in the United States?
Very hard, Glenn. Very hard.
I mean, I think you're right. I think, Mr. McGlothlin, you're right on the substance of it. I'm curious about that.
It's just a dream world, but it won't happen.
Politics is very hard, but you can see in some jurisdictions, even this renaissance that we're having in our energy space, which, by the way, there's only human nature to focus on problems and challenges, whether they're in Washington or otherwise. But if you're looking for reasons to be optimistic about the future of our country, as I think we should be in the long run, Glenn mentioned the mitigation of healthcare cost inflation, which has, if it persists, has huge implications for our long-term fiscal situation. And this renaissance in the energy space is going to be huge over the next 2 or 3 decades. We're already seeing the reshoring of some manufacturing activities that are energy intensive. We're going to begin the exporting of liquefied natural gas. We'd constructed liquefied natural gas terminals around the periphery of the country because we expected to have to import liquefied natural gas. Instead, we're going to be a net exporter of liquefied natural gas. We're already a net exporter of refined petroleum products because Central Latin America didn't have enough refining capacity. So all of this is going to inure to the benefits of our economy. And then, as both of you mentioned, the fact that we have property rights in our country, transparent forums you can go to, litigate your differences, enforce your property rights, your contractual rights, those sorts of things. Huge systemic advantage for America vis-a-vis some other places. So, but short answer, Glenn, nuclear, very difficult. And that accident, it was difficult before the accident. After the accident, even more difficult. By the way, one just digression back to what you asked me before, no third party, but what I think you might see, for those of you who remember the 2000 election, Gore v. Bush was decided by Florida, and I think the Supreme Court, it was 700 votes, something like that in Florida. Ralph Nader got 90-some thousand votes in the state of Florida, maybe more. Now, almost all those people were either non-voters or they would have voted for Al Gore. I don't think there were a whole lot of potential George W. Bush voters voting for Ralph Nader. My point simply is that was enough, the presence of that third-party candidate was enough to change the outcome of the election. So rather than a lasting third-party movement, I do think it's more possible that you would see either a left candidate or a right candidate serve as a sort of spoiler role if they found that they believe that the main party nominee was just insufficiently ideologically correct. It's more likely you'd see that sort of thing.
And to underscore the importance of the justice system, when in any other country where you might have had a Bush versus Gore, there could have been a revolution, and instead, everybody abided by the ruling of the Supreme Court.
So one thing I think is interesting is that I was told recently, and another person confirmed it, that the United States is one of, if not the only countries in the world where individuals can own mineral rights. In every other country in the world, they're owned by the government, and then you got to say "Mother, may I" to go drill. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've had having the individual entrepreneur and the associated incentive and ingenuity at work is one of the reasons why we've had this revolution we've talked about as one of the things that demonstrates, I think, why this is such a great country, because it's one of the few places in the world where you could have been accomplished, maybe the only place.
True.
What about alternative energy that we all hear about, solar and biomass? Nobody's mentioned that.
Well, look, I've looked pretty carefully at this. I think it's really, really important. But it's going to have to compete economically with natural gas. So the natural gas coming in the marketplace has significantly reduced the cost of existing energy sources with which the renewables have to compete, right? So you're going to have to find ways to, so if you look at it, there are places where wind is particularly good, where tide is particularly good, where you've got an existing manufacturing process that generates the biomass which you can reuse right away. So there are individual microeconomic places where you can make it work, but overall, it's going to be it's not going to be cost competitive. That's kind of point one for now. Now, the technology will progress, and the cost will come down, and maybe we'll find some places. But you can't just make a broad statement, offshore wind is good. Offshore wind is good in places where there's lots of offshore wind, and you don't have to, and it's pretty close to where the offshore wind can be used, so you don't have a huge amount of cost of delivery, and that works, right? Biomass is good in some places I described. Hydro is better in some places I described. The other thing which is interesting about this is, one of the major problems with renewables, which I'm a big fan of, is that we have to have huge advances, which we haven't got yet in battery technology, storage technologies. So because it turns out that the sun's not shining when most people want to do things like watch TV or do their laundry or cook dinner, right? So you can't really, and if you want to watch the Yankees game and the wind's not blowing, you would still want to be able to run your TV set in order to watch the game, right? So you got to sort of find ways to store it. Today, do you know what the most efficient method for storing energy is?
No.
In large quantities? Pumping water uphill. Right? So when you generate the energy, you use it to move water uphill to a large reservoir, and then you leave that reservoir, which is basically embodied energy, sitting uphill, and then roll it back down again. Now, that's something which Archimedes figured out, right? So it's not necessarily, so we have the major there's some major technological advances we need to actually make these things work. But I'm all for it. I've got a lot of investments in it. I think it's going to be really good for our country. By the way, so and the other point I'd make, if you look at this, it might sound a little geeky, but you guys saw my lunch presentation, so why not keep going? Which is it's taken historically about 50 years to go from one form of energy use in the United States to another. We were about 50 years of a wood economy. They were about 50 years of a coal economy, and we're about 30 years into the 50 years of kind of the oil and gas replacing coal. And then, so even if we have widespread use of renewables, it will be a small part for a very meaningful period of time. And while it will make a contribution, won't be able to supplant the use of fossil fuels in any meaningful time period, any relevant time period.
As we talk about cybersecurity, which I suspect maybe someone might want to talk about today, don't you think that by getting off the grid and using renewables, that people will feel more comfortable? Because everybody's so worried about being on the grid and what that might mean in a cyber attack.
Well, I think you and I might be thinking about different things. I think the grid that's implicated in the cyber attacks is the communications grid, not the electricity grid. Now, the electricity grid is vulnerable. For instance, one of the things we learned in 9/11 in New York was that we all had the same electricity provider and the same telecommunications provider. So they're both, and so that was a single point of failure. Everybody thought they had redundancy, but they're all using Con Ed and Verizon, right? And so we figured out how to kind of, move our backups in places that are less vulnerable. So it is part of the problem, but the electricity, going off the electricity grid, I assume there's some people who are sort of doing the whole Jeremiah Johnson thing out in the middle of Montana, for whom that sort of, it gives them a false sense of security, but I think it's really the communications grid that's the transmission point of vulnerability for the cybersecurity.
Okay, well, moving along, Linda, do you think it's time to reform Sarbanes-Oxley?
Well, I'm still thinking about it. So I don't know that we've had sufficient time to let what we like to call SOX wind through the system. So I'm not ready to say yes, but I suspect that the gentleman to my left or right may have a different opinion.
So when Henry Kissinger met Zhou Enlai in China, in that famous trip to China, and he asked him, do you think the French Revolution was successful? And Zhou Enlai said, we don't know yet. We haven't had time to tell yet. It was only 100 years ago, 200 years ago. I think that Sarbanes-Oxley, I think we've all learned to live with it. There have been some meaningful reforms. I think what was it, that jobs? What was the bill that was recently called?
Around the crowdsource funding.
Yeah, no, but there's been some relaxation of it for small companies,
right.
Which is helpful. I think it's called the Jobs Act. Relax it for small companies, so the burden not that great. I think some things that are kind of silly about it. One of my favorites is that one of the things we learned in the whole Enron sort of scandal was that you didn't want management teams who were in the pocket of boards that were in the pocket of management teams who had all these independence rules, which are good and important things. But the way the rules were written, for instance, is if you're a shareholder, you're not considered independent of management. And I'm not sure why that is the case, right? Because actually, you're actually, if you represent the shareholders, that's the ultimate independence, because that's what you're supposed to be doing. So that's kind of a silly thing that's embedded in Sarbanes-Oxley, but it's just annoying, so why bring it up? But I think the 404 rules, which are the ones people primarily complain about, we've learned how to live with. Got more accountants and lawyers employed as a result of that. Maybe it's a good thing.
Very good.
It's not I don't see it as a dire need to sort of reform at this point.
I can tell you a story, Jim, about Sarbanes-Oxley and its enactment that may give you some insight into how things happen in Washington. I was on the banking committee all 12 years, and so Chairman Sarbanes Enron had collapsed, had the huge scandals, of course, and the different things that had been brought to light as a result of all that, so something had to be done. But as is normally the case in Washington, it goes a little too far, and then you've got to figure out how to refine it and correct it and so forth and so on. So the three members of the banking committee who were kind of taking our time, that there was a rush. There was a editorial every other day in the Washington Post or the New York Times, you got to do this, we got to do this, we got to go all the way. And the three members of the banking committee that were going a little bit slower to try and think it through were former governors who had to work with our business communities and attract investment. So it was Tom Carper from Delaware, Zell Miller from Georgia, we were talking about a little earlier, myself. So The chairman calls me in at one point. He said, you know, Evan, what are your concerns about this? So I said, well, look, Paul, I know we got to do something about this. Nobody wants another Enron, but and you mentioned the shareholders. He said, I'll tell you what my concern is. I'm concerned that if we go too far, we'll impose more costs on the shareholders.
Right, well, that's what's happened.
Than the harm that has been imposed on the shareholders. It will be actually counter-shareholder productive. So I'm trying to strike the right balance, protecting the shareholders, but don't make it so costly and onerous you actually end up hurting the very people you're trying to protect. That's what's going through my mind. So he's listening to all this, and he says, well, okay, it makes sense to me. What do you recommend? I said, I'm not an accountant. I don't know. This is very technical stuff. But I'll tell you what I'd do if I were you. There must be a couple of CFOs of significant companies in Maryland who you trust. They're not just going to go in the tank for industry. I'd call them up and I'd say, here's what I'm thinking about. Tell me, how would this work in the real world? You know, do you think, how costly would this be? What would this really do in terms of trying to prevent what we had happen with Enron? So that's what I'd do. I'd find somebody who was an expert in the private sector and solicit their opinion about it. He looked at his top 8, and he looked back at me and he said, oh, I never thought about that. That's a great idea. And I thought, oh boy, we got trouble. Because I don't think they ever did. But I'm glad that everybody's learned to live with it. So apparently it wasn't a complete calamity.
Well, Senator Byer, what measure would you propose to reduce deficits, either by increasing revenues or reducing expenditures or a combination thereof?
Well, Jim, you know, this has been a wonderful function we've had here. Sorry to see our time is about up. Well, look, you know, there are only so many moving parts to the puzzle here. By far and away, I think the best thing you can do, Glenn's presentation earlier had profound implications on a number of levels, not least of which is the federal budget situation, because it is remarkable the impact on federal revenues and therefore the budget situation that even somewhat marginal increases in the rate of growth can produce. Right. So the first thing I would do would be to look, I would put every decision I was making, doesn't mean I'd end up, you know, this wouldn't be the sole thing I'd think about, but every decision, you know, fiscally, monetarily, regulatorily, I would view somewhat through a prism of what's this going to do for growth, investment, job creation, getting those animal spirits back up again, innovation, all those things that really will get the economy moving once again. That is by far the best thing we can do to begin to get the deficit down. Now, that probably won't be enough, although we saw in the Clinton years, some of that might have been an unsustainable boom in the tech space, but we saw in the Clinton years when more rapid rates of growth helped to solve the deficit problem pretty quickly, but that is also not all that was done then. So you got to get your hands on the entitlement problem. That's probably going to mean something in terms of benefits. And we can start with something the president has proposed. It's called chain CPI, and that's a term of art. What it basically means is that the way we currently calculate the cost of living increases every year, according to economists and technical experts, may overstate the rate of inflation. So the rates are going up a little bit too much. And if you had it more statistically accurate, it would not only reduce spending a little bit, but because the brackets for taxes would not be adjusted upward as rapidly, would also increase revenues. So each side would get a little bit of something. Some lower benefits, which the Republicans would like, some more revenues, which the Democrats would like. That would be a place to start. Then you got to end up looking at some other things like means testing, you know, benefits. Some of us on the stage here today are probably in a position where we might not need to. And it's interesting, the Social Security was changed, I think, in the Carter years to be a little more generous. Some of us may not need the cost of living increase for our Social Security benefits. So, you know, you look at some things like that. One thing that has been looked at, it was done before the last time entitlements were focused on, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill agreed to raise the retirement age. People are living longer, they're working longer. You got to be somewhat concerned about the kind of occupations and how physically demanding they are, so forth and so on. I can tell you from putting my political hat on, it's amazing that Reagan and O'Neill pulled that off, because that tests out at about a 90% unpopularity thing. So that would probably be the last element that would be included in a reform, but is something that would be debated as well. And on the revenue side, you know, it's pretty, you know, the different options there. We did have taxes go up on people making more than $450,000 as a couple. My guess is the Republicans in the Congress won't go for any increase in marginal rates. As a matter of fact, there's a big push to try and get the corporate rate down to make us more globally competitive. but you would look at different tax preferences as possibly a place, without increasing marginal rates, as a place that you could generate some revenue for the government and still allow yourself to get the corporate code in a different place, but in a more globally competitive place. By the way, in this, there's a deal, I think, Glenn, waiting to be done on the corporate side of things. The accountants, CBO, OMB, others in Washington, indicate that if we got the corporate rate down to a more competitive place, that would generate incrementally more rapid growth, which then brings in more revenue without raising taxes. There's a debate about whether to use all that to make the rates even lower, which the Republicans would like, or to take some of that revenue to deal with other things, which the Democrats would like. But somewhere in there, there's a deal waiting to be struck, but it's so polarized they just can't get there. And oh, by the way, one person's tax preference or loophole is another person's tax increase, so you got to look at the list. But the big ones, and the big ones, it's difficult politically to get there. Charitable deduction. Our friends, the hospitals you were asking about, they would be apoplectic about that in some ways. Institutions of higher learning would be very concerned about that. The health care deduction. A long time, I think Glenn is exactly right. The rise of our current health care system had its roots in World War II, and it's kind of a Rube Goldberg system, and we took some steps in the Affordable Care Act to deal with the most, they were called Cadillac plans or that sort of thing, to begin to shift away. But that beginning to tax health care benefits, that's very unpopular. How about the home interest deduction? At a time when real estate is beginning to recover, that's not going to be terribly popular either. So the big ones that generate most of the money, you kind of go through, and politically it's just very difficult. And then you get to the more niche ones, and they raise some money, but it's not nearly as much.
So I think Evan said a bunch of really smart things, all of which I agree with. But I want to turn one of the things he said on its head and look at it from a completely opposite perspective. But this is not meant to disagree at all, which is, I think, the most important thing for growth the federal government can do is get its house in order. Right? In other words, if you could project for the business community a declining federal debt as a percent of GDP over time in a way that is binding and reliable to the business community, this issue would be off the table and people would be planning for the future. A lot of people say, how can government create jobs? And I would say that government doesn't create jobs. Government creates the conditions under which businesses can create jobs. And that's one of the most important things we can do for that purpose. Now, when I was in my team in the Clinton White House, I went back to my natural habitat as a capitalist. But the guys who I worked with who stayed there got the budget balanced, through a combination of tax increases, which we were pilloried for, and spending cuts, which required a government shutdown to get done, but happened. And that occurred, by the way, Evan, you know the history of this better than I do, at least 3 pieces. There was the Andrews Air Force Base Agreement that was at the end of the Bush administration, which is one of the reasons people think Bush was weak in his 1992 election, because he went back on his no new tax, read my lips pledge. Then there was the first budget that we put out where we didn't get any Republican votes, but we got the deficit going down. That was 93. And then there was the 96, 97 budget negotiations between Erskine Bowles and Newt Gingrich, right, with the president, obviously, very involved. Those 3 things all together ended up being Republicans and Democrats, one done by Bush, 2 done by Clinton, one done without Republican support, but 2 done with important Republican collaboration. Everybody's involved, right? Ended up generating in the late 90s a balanced budget. So my point is that, we've had so far, we had the Budget Control Act, we had of 11, then we had the sequester, and maybe we'll get something done now, and those are all moving us on a more sustainable path. One thing people are not really understanding right now is because of the sequester and because of the economic recovery, the projections for budget deficits that were produced a year ago are much higher than those that are being produced now. So we're actually moving in the right direction kind of already, and maybe we can't get it done all at once. Maybe each of these crises can be used to put piece in place that gets us there. And that's what's happened in the past. I think we can do that. And so I think it's a good thing. I am personally for increase in taxes. I would personally, as an investor, I would make an investment in higher taxes in order to get the necessary reforms and entitlements done as a part of a deal. So I would throw more taxes on the table in order to get the entitlement spending reforms done that are necessary to have the whole thing work. Because I do think you're not going to be able to solve this problem without doing both. And by the way, a lot of people who are for Simpson Bowles, we talked about this morning, Erskine's a good personal friend of mine, I'm a big supporter of his, don't realize the extent of the taxes that are in that, either as a result of reducing what are called tax expenditures, which you just reviewed, mortgage deduction, mortgage interest rate deduction, charitable deduction, et cetera. But I think that's the right kind of format, which everybody brings something to the table. But I think the most important objective is not getting to a balanced budget, which is why I was highlighted that issue a little bit from the late 90s, but reducing and this is the math that Evan was getting at from a different perspective, is reducing the growth stopping the growth and the beginning to reduce the debt as a percent of GDP. Government debt as a percent of GDP, and the current estimate, the Bowles-Simpson thing, got it to about 62.5% before it began to go back down again. The deal that was on the table in last December got it going up to about 72% before it came back down again. It's very important that it not get to and not sustain levels above 80 to 100%. I view in that we get it heading back down again kind of over time. And that's a function of two things. One is spending less deficit spending and also more economic growth. And I think we'll get there. They'll come together the way you described.
Two final points on this. We've been very fortunate at a time when we've been leveraging up the national balance sheet that interest rates have been as low as they have.
No, it's a really important point.
If we're looking at an environment where interest rates are likely to begin to start creeping up, the service on our debt is going to become much more expensive. And that's one of the reasons to act now to get our long-term house in order, to try and mitigate the long-term costs of servicing our debt. That's number one. Number two, there's been an institution referenced several times today up there in Cambridge, and there was an interesting proposal made by, believe it or not, there is a Republican economist at Harvard, Martin Feldstein.
Which a whole bunch of them.
Yeah. The reason I mentioned, I thought he came up with actually a kind of an elegant solution to this tax expenditure issue. Rather than have the charge of the light brigade politically, which is to say we're going to cut your more home interest deduction, we're going to cut your charitable deduction, we're going to limit your health care cost deduction, or get into the deductibility of interest, which could potentially be really destabilizing for a lot of investments and things like that. He would just say, you can take any deductions you want, you can take all these, you can take any of them. We're just going to cap the aggregate amount you can take at 3% of your adjusted gross income. So that way, it allows the members to say, we voted for a general cap, but for any particular person, we didn't vote to eliminate your deduction this way or that. I thought that was kind of an interesting finesse he came up with, which had some potential political appeal. They haven't picked up on it yet. But
it was talked about as one of the pieces of the puzzle in last December, right? But it hadn't gotten traction.
So as a tax increase, would you favor eliminating capital gains for the commissions hedge funds receive?
For capital gains. The ideal situation would be to, and this is sort of roughly what they accomplished in Simpson Bowles, would be to get to a level of ordinary income taxes where you don't need to worry about the distinction. In other words, if you did this sort of thing that Evans talked about, by taking away what are called tax expenditures, which is spending, everybody knows what that is, which is, there's a bunch of spending that doesn't look like spending because it's done through the tax code. But it really is spending. Everybody in the world knows it's spending. And that's the charitable interest deduction, the mortgage interest deduction, the state and local tax deduction, and a few others, right? It's really spending, but we disguise it as a tax deduction. It's known as a tax expenditure. If you eliminate those tax expenditures or limit, like Simpson Bowles suggested, or limit them in a way that Evans suggested, you can then get to ordinary income rates at levels where they're low enough so you're not deterring capital gains investment by having capital gains rates that are too high. So I think that's the answer.
For example, if your marginal rate now is, what's the top marginal rate now, 39, something like that?
30, I think it's back to 39.6.
Yeah, 39.6, and the current capital gains is what, 25? So there's a difference there of 14.6. If by closing some of these preferences, expenditures, loopholes, however we want to characterize them, you got the top rate down, to half of what it is today, the difference by half, then it becomes not such a big deal, right?
Right. You want to, my view is you don't want to discourage capital formation. I think so having a low capital gains rate kind of is important. It doesn't have to be lower than the ordinary income rate to accomplish that. But I think in particularly in an era where we have a lot of, our tax system has encouraged historically healthcare and real estate. Right, because you didn't have to pay taxes on your employer-provided health care and had all these real estate deductions. And what have we ended up in our country? Too much health care and too much real estate, right? It discouraged you couldn't deduct costs of education. And what have we ended up with? Not enough education, in my view. In other words, people actually respond to tax incentives in very important and fundamental ways. And one of the things you want to do is encourage investment rather than consumption as part of our solution to our set of economic problems. So I think bringing ordinary income tax rates down the way you described is a very good thing. Taking capital gains tax rates up, I think, would be a negative thing to do.
Well, with that, I think we have met our time constraints, and thank our panelists again for very interesting discussion on many, many subjects, and it's obvious that all three of you are very well informed on those subjects you spoke about. And again, on behalf of William and Mary and Fran and myself, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
If I may, on behalf of the business school and the law school, I want to thank all of our panelists as well. Just to add to what Jim McGlothlin has just said, this has been such a fascinating discussion, and I think we're all fortunate to have heard it, and I think we're fortunate that this has been filmed so that others will be able to see it as well. As I was listening to these four, something occurred to me that I want to mention to the students who are in the room, particularly the law students. We have before you distinguished leaders in politics, in law, and in business, but they all have something in common. They all graduated from a law school, and they went off in very different directions. This conference is about training William and Mary students, whether in business or law and any other field, to be leaders. And I just want to give comfort to those of you who are wondering, what's that first job going to be? You can go in a lot of different directions in life, whether you've been trained for business or trained for law. And these guys are great exemplars, and look at the diverse paths they took. So thank you for being here. Thank you, guys.
Are you going to give the Dean of the Business School equal time on this?
Notice I got to go last. Thank you very much.